On the morning of October 25th, 1415, the fate of two kingdoms hung in the balance. All military logic pointed to a swift and brutal conclusion: the total annihilation of a small, starving army of just 6,000 Englishmen. Facing them was the full might of French chivalry, a host of up to 30,000 men. The English were a ghost of a force, ravaged by disease and on the brink of collapse. The stage was set for a massacre. But here's what historians got wrong. By all rights, this should have been a footnote in a century of war. But it became a legend, an impossible victory born not of divine intervention, but of strategic genius, human resilience, and a field of suffocating mud. The question isn't how the English won, but how a desperate king, facing certain defeat, turned a catastrophe into a victory that still echoes in history. In this video, we will peel back the romanticized layers of the Battle of Agincourt to reveal the gritty, brutal truth. We'll show you how a brilliant tactical masterclass, a new kind of army, and a single chilling gamble changed the course of the 100 Years' War forever. This is a story of courage, leadership, and how one man's vision redefined the very nature of war. Our story begins months earlier, not on a battlefield, but in the halls of power. Henry V, a king just 2 years on the throne, had a single burning obsession. He believed he was the rightful ruler of France, a centuries-old claim he inherited from his great-grandfather. After diplomacy failed, Henry decided to press that claim with an invasion. He assembled a vast fleet and an army of nearly 12,000 men, a force of unprecedented scale. Their first target, the strategic port of Harfleur. Henry expected a quick victory, but Harfleur refused to yield. The city's defenders, though outnumbered, put up a ferocious fight for 5 long, grueling weeks. But the city's cannons weren't the real enemy. An invisible killer was stalking the English camp. Dysentery, known as the bloody flux. The disease tore through the cramped, unsanitary English lines, claiming thousands of lives. The army was bleeding men faster than it could lose them in battle. By the time Harfleur finally surrendered, Henry's great invasion had captured a single town at a catastrophic cost. His once proud force was now a weary shadow of its former self, numbering just 9,000 men. His nobles urged him to cut his losses and sail home, but retreat was not an option. A return to England in shame would be a political disaster for a king whose throne was built on a recent usurpation. So, in a desperate gamble, he chose a different path. He would not run. He would march his remaining army, now a weary force of perhaps 8,000 men, overland for more than 100 miles to the English-held port of Calais, a defiant gesture to prove he could walk through enemy territory whenever he pleased. The march was a gauntlet of misery. The soldiers, many still weak with illness, trudged through hostile lands. They were starving, cold and exhausted. All the while, they were being watched. The French, now fully mobilized, had a vast army shadowing them, always present, always just out of reach. Henry's plan for a quick dash to Calais hit a major snag, the River Somme. He raced to the main crossing, only to find it heavily guarded. Forced to march south, away from his destination, Henry wasted precious days looking for a place to cross. Every day of delay allowed the French army to grow stronger and get ahead of him. The English felt less like a defiant army and more like hunted animals being herded towards a killing ground. On October 24th, after weeks of a desperate march, the English felt a flicker of hope. They had crossed the River Somme. But it didn't last long. English scouts crested a ridge and froze. Spread across the valley before them, blocking their path to safety, was the French army. It was immense, with as many as 30,000 men. The trap had sprung. There was no escape. That night, The two camps were worlds apart. In the French camp, it was a carnival of confident celebration. Convinced of their victory, they feasted, drank, and gambled, boasting of the easy ransoms they'd collect from the English nobles. But here's what they failed to see. The English camp was another world entirely. There was no feasting here, just soldiers gnawing on their last rations. There were no victory songs, only the quiet murmur of confessions as the rain lashed down, churning the ground into a thick, clinging mud. It must have felt like God himself had abandoned them. But their king hadn't. Henry V walked among his men that night, not as a king, but as a fellow soldier. He knew their fear. Many, too sick to move, simply lay in the cold mud, their prayers a silent plea for an end to their suffering. Yet Henry offered no false hope, only a shared resolve. He knew that for all their arrogance, the French nobles had made one critical mistake. They had assumed their numbers and honor would be enough. But on a battlefield where every step was a struggle, grit and determination would be worth more than any pedigree. Henry V, a brilliant commander, didn't see a trap. He saw a gift. He knew the narrowness of the field was a blessing. It would stop the massive French army from surrounding his tiny force. They'd be funneled into a bottleneck of his choosing. And the ground itself, that rain-soaked clay field, would become his greatest weapon. He gave two crucial orders. First, his archers were to plant their sharpened stakes in front of their lines, creating a deadly hedge against charging horses. This was a deliberate and calculated tactic, designed to turn the French cavalry's greatest strength into a fatal weakness. It was a simple yet brilliant act of military genius. The morning of October 25th, St. Crispin's Day, dawned grey and cold. For 3 hours, the two armies just stared at each other across the sea of mud. The French, still supremely confident, expected the English to make a suicidal charge. But Henry held his ground. He knew the mud would exhaust his enemy. He would let the French come to them. Finally, Henry gave the order. With a sound like a tearing storm, 5,000 English and Welsh longbowmen loosed in unison. A terrifying hailstorm of steel-tipped wood rained down, with as many as 60,000 arrows falling every minute. The effect was catastrophic. While the best plate armor could deflect a shot, the sheer volume found every gap and weak spot. The most devastating effect was on the horses. Maddened with pain, the war horses panicked, crashing back into their own infantry, sowing chaos and churning the field into a bloody quagmire. The French cavalry charge was a complete disaster, funneled into the deadly wall of sharpened stakes. The mud had become the English army's most valuable ally. The French knights, their advance a monumental effort, were tired before they even reached the English line. They were packed so tightly, so hopelessly, that many couldn't even raise their arms to fight. The English line bent, but it didn't break. This evidence has never been shown before. The English archers, their quivers spent, dropped their bows. But they weren't done. Lightly equipped and not weighed down by armor, they grabbed hatchets and hammers and swarmed in from the flanks. They fell upon the trapped and exhausted French knights, who were now easy prey. Many, pulled down into the mud and pinned under the weight of fallen men and horses, simply drowned in the bloody mire. Wait until you see what happens next. In the midst of this chaos, a rumor spread. The French were attacking the English baggage train. At the same time, the French third line appeared to be regrouping. Henry V knew his army was too small to fight on two fronts. He faced a chilling choice: risk being overwhelmed or eliminate the thousands of prisoners he'd just taken. In a ruthless decision driven by battlefield necessity, Henry ordered that all prisoners be executed. Many of his knights, fearing the loss of lucrative ransoms, considered the act ignoble and largely refused. The grim task was left to a squire and his archers, who methodically stabbed their helpless victims. It was a chilling act that shattered the romanticized image of medieval warfare, revealing that survival, not chivalry, was the prize of the day. When the fighting finally stopped, perhaps after only 3 hours, the field was a scene of unimaginable carnage. French losses were catastrophic, with as many as 6,000 men dead, a figure that includes 3 dukes, 9 counts, and the Constable of France himself. It was a bloodbath for the French nobility. English losses, by contrast, were shockingly light, perhaps only a few hundred men, with the Duke of York being the most significant casualty. The lopsided result seemed impossible, a clear sign to the English of God's favor. Henry and his battered, victorious army finally marched on to Calais. They returned to England not in shame, but as conquering heroes. Henry V paraded through London to celebrate one of the greatest military triumphs in the nation's history. This final detail will change everything. The legacy of Agincourt extends far beyond the battlefield. The catastrophic loss of life among the French nobility created a political vacuum that fueled the French Civil War and led to the Treaty of Troyes, which recognized Henry V as heir to the French throne. This defeat would force the French monarchy to abandon its reliance on noble levies and forge the first permanent, professional standing army in Europe, changing the nature of warfare forever. If you're hungry for more stories of impossible victories and the human excellence that makes them happen, there are countless resources to explore. For further reading, check out Juliet Barker's groundbreaking book, Agincourt, the King, the Campaign, the Battle, or Bernard Cornwell's historical novel, Agincourt. For film, you can't go wrong with the classic 1944 version of Shakespeare's Henry V, or the more modern depiction in The King. To walk the hallowed ground yourself, visit the modern-day Centre Agincourt 1415 Museum in the village of Agincourt, France. For more stories of incredible military history and human excellence, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching.